I want to change people's perspective in terms of just because you can't see what plants are doing doesn't mean that there isn't something cool happening inside. Probably what they're saying is those humans are ruining this planet. I think carnivorous plants still hold a special place in my heart. And I'm torn between two. I mean, if plants could talk, if they were able to communicate with each other in the way that we do, we might have a whole different story in terms of how we might be able to coexist with those plants. Well, you have to remember that just broadly, no trait exists in a population unless it enhances biological fitness in some way. So they can't survive without each other because the plant would die without those nitrates and phosphates, which are very difficult to get out of the soil because soil particles are negatively charged. So those repel. Nitrate and phosphate as anions repel, and therefore they don't stay in the soil for that long. What about the plant that's at the Blodell Conservatory that releases bad smelling things?
Oh yeah.
So it attracts pollinators that we typically wouldn't think of pollinators. So dung beetles, flesh flies. When you're out and about and enjoying nature, respect the plants that are there because they contribute to that nature in a very important way for you to enjoy. Plants don't have a brain, so there's no processing of this information, but there are still signals that can be transmitted between different parts of the plant to give the plant some information about what's going on in the rest of the plant body as well as what's going on in the environment. So I think in that respect, making sure that we take care of our pollinators is really important because it is essential to the survival of our angiosperms. And without angiosperms, we don't have food for us, because a lot of the things that we eat that are plant-based come from angiosperms.
Since the beginning, we have been taught one thing, that animals move, think, hunt, and feel. Plants, well, they just sit there. No eyes, no ears, no drama, no roar, just green, boring silence. But what if I tell you that silence isn't empty? What if beneath that stillness lies a story more ancient, more powerful, and more essential than we ever care to notice? They came first, they made oxygen. They built the stage on which us animals, the Homo sapiens, perform and thrive. Hello everyone, my name is Harsh Sandilya, and I'm the president of Capilano Dialogue of Science Club. Today, on the second episode of Mind Meets Matter, we are asking an important question. Are plants actually not lesser organisms than animals? And to help us crack open this leafy mystery, we have here with someone who doesn't just teach biology, she flips your perspective on it. She is a voice students remember, a mind rooted in deep knowledge and fierce advocate for often ignored billions of plants. Please welcome Dr. Eunice Chin, an experienced professor, researcher, a good friend and asset of the club, and someone who believes that being rooted doesn't mean being dull. Let's begin. Hello, Dr. Eunice.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for agreeing for this. So my first question is a little personal. What inspired your passion for defending the complexity and significance of plants?
To be perfectly honest, when I was in undergrad, plants were not horribly exciting for me. But when I started teaching, one of my colleagues fiercely advocated for plants. He used to say that plants were very cool, and he would give examples. And then I stumbled into teaching a plant physiology class, and the more I read and learned, the more excited I got about plants. So I want to change people's perspective in terms of just because you can't see what plants are doing doesn't mean that there isn't something cool happening inside.
Well, yeah, that's quite interesting and inspiring, to be honest. Well, let's dive deep into the topic of today. Let's start from the evolution, the start of all the story. Okay, so from an evolutionary standpoint, what are the key differences between the evolutionary path of plants and animals?
Well, firstly, plants came out of water first and came onto land. And they had to deal with all of the same problems that animals faced when they came onto land. So what is your support against gravity? Preventing desiccation, that sort of thing. And when these populations adapted to the terrestrial environment, it opened up a whole variety of habitats for animals to come onto land and exploit. So providing both food and shelter for these animals.
Well, as we started talking about the evolution and food, the initial, nutrition is really important for organisms. And what do you think, like, in what ways do plants demonstrate nutritional advantages over animals, particularly in their role as primary producers?
Well, without plants, none of us would be here because they are the primary producers. They are the food basis for many animals that then other animals eat. So without plants, we wouldn't have the variety of animals that we have. They also produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, so that oxygen is important for us in terms of cellular respiration, and important for them too, because they also perform cellular respiration.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for such an interesting insight about nutrition. It actually makes me curious about how do they reproduce? Like plant reproduction is so unique and different. Can you walk us through the major strategies they use to reproduce?
Sure. So let's focus primarily on angiosperms because that's probably the most widespread group of plants and the most successful. So unlike animals, plants can't get up and find their mates. So they have to find some way for those gametes to meet. And in angiosperms, they use the assistance of pollinators, both animals and particularly insects and birds as pollinators. This is one of the reasons why angiosperms are so successful, because the bee or the hummingbird will pick up that pollen after they get their nectar reward, and then they will go to the reproductive structures of another plant of the same species and deposit that pollen there by accident because they're not really thinking about doing it themselves. And then that way you ensure that the gametes of your species end up meeting. Compared to things like gymnosperms that depend on the wind, they have to produce lots and lots of gametes in hopes that the wind will be able to pick it up and encounter another reproductive structure of their own species. And that's what makes us miserable in the springtime, because there's so much of that pollen there.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Talking about pollinations and pollinators, one of the major pollinators, as you mentioned, are animals like bees, insects, and other birds, us animals too sometimes. So, dispersal of gametes and dispersal of seeds, both they uses vectors, different vectors, and they reward them as in fruits, as in nectar. Sometimes I think that plants are so they're so clever, or they are so intelligent that they use us, but one can also argue that it might be symbiotic relationship, both are getting benefited. What's your thing, like, are they deceiving animals, or that's some kind of symbiotic?
Absolutely, it's a symbiotic relationship, because the relationship wouldn't exist if there wasn't mutual benefits on both sides. So plants get the dispersal of either their gametes or their seeds. Animals get the benefit of a nectar reward if they're a pollinator, and then the nutrition of the fruit if they are the disperser of the seeds.
My next question is just built up on this topic. Let's talk about what happens after pollination. How do plants provide parental care? Because we know mammals are super good in parental care. They secure and they give proper nutrition and everything to their offspring. How do plants make sure that their offsprings, like their new plants, how do they give them proper parental care?
Parental care in plants is not what we would typically think of parental care as you were talking about in mammals. I would argue that the parental care in plants is more so in form of protection. So the seeds in angiosperms, for example, are protected by the fruit. And within that seed, the little embryo is provided some nourishment in the form of the endosperm, which is some lipids and some proteins and some starches. So that little embryo can use that as their food source, because if you think about it, when they germinate, they root first and then the shoot. So they aren't going to be photosynthetic immediately. So that food supply is going to be what sustains that little embryo until it has photosynthetic parts. And then the fruit in angiosperms especially for those that are being consumed by dispersers for the purpose of seed dispersal, that fruit also provides, and the seed coat provides some protection to that embryo in the process of dispersal.
Well, yeah, that's a really fascinating point, talking about how do they secure the seeds and how do they, make sure that the new offspring gets proper nutrition when they germinate. Now then that we have covered that topic, let's shift gears and discuss the next topic, which is growth. And that's really important because as we know that plants can grow continuously, like if you chop off their branches, if something happens, they can grow their new branch and new parts. Animals lack these kind of characteristics. So what do you think from like evolutionary and both evolutionary and physiological perspective, how do they get these kind of special ability, and how this kind of ability is helping them to survive?
Well, you have to remember that just broadly, no trait exists in a population unless it enhances biological fitness in some way. So for plants, this is ultimately about enhancing biological fitness. So in plants, their specific problem is that they can't move. So unlike animals, which if it's too hot, they can get up and move. If they want food, they get up and move. If they see a mate, they get up and move. This is not something that plants can do. So if they end up being shaded, or if they end up depleted of minerals in the soil, they can't simply just get up and move to a sunnier spot or a more mineral-rich spot. So they have to change their morphology to access those nutrients. So grow taller to get access to light, and branch their roots to reach new sources of these minerals. So this would enhance their survival, and therefore it gets passed on to the next generation, because those are the individuals that survive and reproduce.
Okay, that's a really great explanation. It takes me to the next topic. Let's talk about, as you mentioned, that they change their morphology, they have some complex structures. Let's talk about the homologous, or the similarities or differentiation between animals and plants when we talk about a thinking capability or something which can control, like in animals we have proper neural system and a proper system to tackle stimulus, transfer it from one point to another and process it and give proper feedback to stimulus. How do plants have any similar kind of, or how do they tackle their stimulus, and how do they respond to those stimulus?
There's a couple of different ways. So plants don't have a brain, so there's no processing of this information, but there are still signals that can be transmitted between different parts of the plant to give the plant some information about what's going on in the rest of the plant body, as well as what's going on in the environment. So plants are capable of generating action potentials, which we would typically associate with animals. It's the same idea. It's an electrical signal that is generated, meant to be fast, and allows the plant to collect information about itself. And the second way that they do it is through photoreceptors. So they can detect light, and they use length of day or length of night to give them information about what's going on in their environment, so that they can then either reproduce or go into dormancy, for example, for the winter.
Yeah, these are such an interesting insight. Let's get on the next topic, which is related to this same topic, like how do they communicate between their own parts. There's a really fascinating thing that plant also releases some chemicals in air to warn its neighbors in case of any pest attacks or any kind of other environmental stimulus which they face that it might be problematic for them. So they interact with their environment or other plants around it. Can you walk us through how do they do that, and what kind of these systems are?
So one example would be wounding by herbivores. So caterpillars are notorious for destroying leaves on plants. Yeah. They need to grow as big as they can before they can metamorphosize and turn into a winged insect. So plants respond to proteins in the saliva of some of these caterpillars and initial a signal transduction cascade. And that will release volatile compounds into the air. These volatile compounds then attract parasitoid wasps that will come and lay their eggs on the caterpillar. That caterpillar will then be literally consumed from the outside in by these developing larvae after they hatch, and that takes care of the problem of the herbivores. So in that case, they're communicating, you could say, or signaling to some other animal that can come and take care of the herbivore that is attacking them presently.
Well, yeah, these are really interesting, to be honest, interesting points, how they have such unique and properly developed mechanism to, tackle these kind of external stimulus or external attack on them. So let's talk about the rule breakers, the parasitic and carnivorous plants. What evolutionary pressures led certain plants to develop carnivorous traits?
Typically, carnivorous plants capture insects for a nitrogen source. Typically, other non-carnivorous plants get their nitrogen from the soil. So you would probably predict that there might have been some sort of nitrogen deficiency in the soil of the plants that were the ancestors of these carnivorous plants. So that would drive selection for a trait where they could obtain a nitrogen source from elsewhere. In this case, trapping and extracting that nitrogen from the proteins in the insects. You'll notice that a lot of carnivorous plants are still green, so they still perform photosynthesis and make their own sugars, but they need the nitrogen to incorporate into their amino acids and make their own proteins. So instead of getting it from the soil, they get it from insect prey.
Oh, that's really interesting. So can we say that the carnivorous plants, they do not totally depend on its prey for their whole nutrition? They make their own nutrition, but just for nitrogen base, they prey and they catch flies and stuff to get only nitrogen.
Most likely, nitrogen is the main driving force for the carnivory.
All right. What if we change their environment and we give them nitrogen-rich environment? How can they change their behavior?
It's unclear, but I think if there were a change in any kind of physiology in carnivorous plants, you would see it happen over many, many thousands or millions of years, and we likely wouldn't be around to see it. But say these plants or these descendants of these plants ended up in a nitrogen-rich environment, it is unlikely that they would keep this trait, because if you can get nitrogen from the soil, why have this extraneous trait to get nitrogen that is much more complex than simply getting it from the soil?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, obviously, it would take long time. We need thousands of years on the evolutionary scale. One more thing about carnivorous plants that always makes me read through it, always makes me interested about them, is their action potential. Their action potential and their chemical signaling or electrical signaling is relatively super fast than other plants. Can you walk us through how different these action potential in carnivorous plants are in compared to other regular plants? And let's go back to evolution again. How did you mention that due to nutrition deficiency they must have acquired this trait to catch and prey? Let's go back to the same time frame, and they must have had these kind of new traits coming in. What made them to increase the action potential? And as we know that's energy required process, what kind of trait do they have to do to balance this thing?
So in a Venus flytrap, for example, which closes like this, the speed at which it closes is very important for the plant, because the faster you close it, the less likely the insect will escape. And because of the way the trap is built with the teeth here, sometimes if it closes either not quite right, like this, where it's a little off kilter, or it doesn't close fast enough, the insect is able to escape. So that would mean that the faster the trap closes means that there's either the duration of the action potential, so from start to finish, or the frequency of action potential firing, so how many you can fire in a given time period, will determine how quickly that trap will close. So the selective pressure there would be for faster, more frequent action potentials to ensure that trap shuts and that insect is trapped and you can utilize their proteins. So you would expect that the initial Venus flytrap ancestors probably didn't close their traps fast enough or aligned them well enough when they closed. So likely those individuals would have been selected out of the population because their action potentials weren't fast enough to trap enough prey to be able to survive. So they didn't reproduce. And only the ones with shorter and more frequent action potentials were successful in trapping prey and therefore were able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation.
Well, I love how you explained that. Speaking of carnivorous plants and their like little different traits than other general plants, they are really interesting as they are super complex, and over the period of time they have been evolved in such a manner. Right now they are surprising everyone, like whoever, like new learners like us who are interacting with or learning about these new traits, and it always surprises us. How do these unusual strategies challenge our assumption as plants? Like we think that plants are simple, and when we talk about these kind of super complex, and this has been been in their trait, like been in their evolutionary history from thousands of years, it challenges our perspective of simplicity of plants. How do you look at that?
I mean, typically most people think of plants as very boring. I mean, even if you look outside right now, that tree's not really doing very much.
Yeah.
We don't expect them to move. We don't expect them to respond. One of the reasons I like talking about carnivorous plants in class is because the plant is actually doing something that you can see. However, plants are not successful as a group because of these kinds of complexities. I think carnivorous plants are kind of a step above typically what plants do, but they needed to be because they needed that strategy to get nitrogen. Typically with other plants like that tree outside, they get their nitrogen from the soil. So while you can't see it, everything exciting is happening on the inside of the plant. And I think that's the reason that why so many people think that they're simple, because they can't see what's going on the inside.
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting point, and thanks for explanation. I have just one question which I'm always curious about. We are talking about like plants. They produce oxygen, they give us fruits, medicinal values, so many different values. But we are also primary producers of carbon dioxide. We respire, like we exhale carbon dioxide through our cellular respiration, through our respiration. And we are doing burning fossil fuels, doing so many other industrial activities which releases huge amount of carbon dioxide and others, which are one of the like major requirement for plants' cellular respiration for their photosynthesis. Can we say that without animals, the carbon dioxide we generate, there will have like a huge impact on the plant biodiversity or the plant life?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
I was just curious about the carbon dioxide which we produce.
Yes.
The animals, humans, we produce through our cellular respiration. Plants need those carbon dioxide, and they produce oxygen which we need. So that's a really nice symbiotic relationship going on. I was just curious, like plants, because when we go back into evolution, when there was no animals like evolved or came out of water, what was the source of carbon dioxide back then for them? Right now, if we remove or just one planet with only plants, can they survive without animals and these the trade-off of oxygen and carbon dioxide within them?
So you have to remember that plants are also living organisms. So what do they do with that sugar that they produce through photosynthesis? They also undergo cellular respiration, and they also produce their own carbon dioxide. So perhaps plants could be self-sufficient with the amount of carbon dioxide they produce and then fix via photosynthesis, because you have to remember that plants don't move and they're not metabolically demanding. So the amount of sugar that they produce is sufficient to keep them alive. And then the carbon dioxide they would then produce through cellular respiration likely would be able to sustain them. Outside of animals, perhaps you would also have unicellular organisms that would be producing carbon dioxide. So I guess the point here is that plants don't need a ton of carbon dioxide, which is also the other reason why, even though we have so many plants, we can't keep up with our carbon dioxide production.
Yeah, that's one of the major causes of the global warming, and there's so many things going on all around the world. One more question regarding that, like plants and animals. What do you think that plants, in an ideal situation, the amount of things plant give to us, that's a net positive on us, on animals, like from, if we see from humans evolution standpoint, we have been always dependent on plants for food, for shelter, for all the different things, and plants also have similar relationship with us, but plant also have like a lot of different kind of relationship with other organism, including fungus and other microbacteria. They are really fascinating. They have symbiotic relationship and like multiple kind of relationship in the soil, in the air. Can you give us some example what kind of relationship plants have with other organisms except us humans?
Sure. So, like you mentioned, fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, there is a symbiotic relationship there between those fungi and those plants. So the fungus is a decomposer. Mm-hmm. It breaks down organic material into accessible forms for the plant. So the proteins, for example, from something that has died, the plant can't access that as proteins. So the fungus will go in, digest things, break them down so that they are things like nitrates and phosphates that come from those different protein structures. Those get transferred to the plant, and then the plant in return provides the fungus with sugars from photosynthesis. So they can't survive without each other because the plant would die without those nitrates and phosphates, which are very difficult to get out of the soil because soil particles are negatively charged. So those repel, nitrate and phosphate as anions repel, and therefore they don't stay in the soil for that long. But the fungus is able to access them and then transfer those to the plant. And then the fungus also doesn't have to worry about getting carbon sources. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The plant will give it to them.
It actually makes me curious about the threat of extinction, because we see like lots of plants getting extinct. They are facing multiple problems for their survival as a species. We see the same kind of thing in animals too, but on a scale, like animals are less prone to extinct as compared to plants. Is there just these physiological differences which make them more vulnerable to extinction, or there is something else going on with plants, which those plants which are being or they are on red list of being extinction?
I think angiosperms in particular are at a greater threat because they have such a dependence on their animal pollinators. And without the animal pollinators, now you lose that direct pollination from a member of one species to another member of that same species. And that would make reproduction very difficult. And if you can't reproduce, your biological fitness is going to be affected. So I think in that respect, making sure that we take care of our pollinators is really important because it is essential to the survival of our angiosperms. And without angiosperms, we don't have food for us, because a lot of the things that we eat that are plant-based come from angiosperms.
Oh yeah, there are so many scary news coming regarding the pollinators, and there are many people who share their thoughts that without pollinators the world is going to be like totally different. Yeah. Let's talk about go to our next topic. There are some questions. If there were one myth about plants that you'd love to see erased from public thinking, what it would be?
I think just going back to what you talked about at the beginning of how plants are simple and not very interesting. I think that with many of the things that we've discussed today, I would argue that we've demonstrated that plants are actually quite interesting. A lot of people, particularly the non-flowering plants, people don't have a lot of appreciation for. But even gymnosperms and non-vascular plants all have their place, and they all are very important in their respective ecosystems. So when you're out and about and enjoying nature, respect the plants that are there because they contribute to that nature in a very important way for you to enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned about ecosystem. It reminds me how much plants contribute to our ecosystem, and like most of the life on our planet is related, like directly or indirectly related to plants. So that's a really interesting point. How do you think that shifting our views of plants affect our understanding of biology, our ecology, and the world around us?
I think understanding that plants are the foundation upon which we build our lives on and build our different species and life on is very important. So understanding that plants are basically the source of food for many animals. They also, both as vegetative food and fruit, and then other animals eat those animals, and so on and so forth up the pyramid. Without that huge foundational base, we really don't have animals, full stop. So I think it's really important to appreciate that foundation that they give us at the base of that pyramid so that the rest of us can exist.
Thank you for that answer. And I know that you are really keen in plants, and you also plant some plants. You also have some plants at your place. What is your favorite bizarre or interesting plant, and why?
I think carnivorous plants still hold a special place in my heart. And I'm torn between two. So there's one called a sundew plant that produces a bunch of sticky stuff on a branch, essentially. And when the insect lands on the sticky stuff, it's trapped, and then the branch curls in and around the insect so that it can't fly away. The other carnivorous plant that I love is a pitcher plant. So they grow these huge, giant bucket-looking like things, and they attract the insect to that pitcher in some fashion. Sometimes it's chemical signals, odorants and things like that. And the insect thinks it's getting a nectar reward, but the edges of that pitcher are slippery. So when they land, they slip and fall into this bucket that's full of digestive enzymes. And the insect is immediately broken down into amino acids for the plant to utilize.
Yeah, pitcher plants are really fascinating. I also find them quite fascinating. And I remember, I think last time when we were talking about carnivorous plants, there was a paper about pitcher plant that they not only attracts insects, they also attracts rodents. And they use their excretory materials for their nutrition.
Absolutely. Can you imagine how much nutrition you would get from a rodent compared to an insect?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's like reading about these kind of their strategies. It makes us think that no, they're not primitive as we think normally. They are quite complex, and they know these kind of strategies, and they are using this for their benefit.
Yeah. Oh, what about the plant that's at the Blodell Conservatory that releases bad smelling things?
Oh yeah.
So it attracts pollinators that we typically wouldn't think of pollinators. So dung beetles, flesh flies, dung beetles or carrion beetles. So those guys will come and pollinate them, and they are able to reduce the competition for pollinators because they're using pollinators that we wouldn't even typically think of as pollinators. And then that ensures that they're going to be able to have their gametes meet and be able to reproduce.
Talking about those kind of plants which have some distinct smell, which we don't find it quite interesting, or not for our chemoreceptors and our receptors. I think one of the plant they have one of the biggest flower. They do one of the biggest flower in the world, and those flowers they plant only flowers in one in 10 years or something. And that flower also stinks really bad for humans.
Yeah.
So that's my final question. If plants could talk, what do you think that they'd say to us?
Probably what they're saying is those humans are ruining this planet. I mean, if plants could talk, if they were able to communicate with each other in the way that we do, we might have a whole different story in terms of how we might be able to coexist with those plants. But for now, there's no reason for them to talk to each other. They're able to exist the way that they are, and they're successful the way that they are. So, but who knows? with the way that humans are changing this planet, maybe in a few million years there will be talking plants.
I won't be alive to see those talking plants.
Nor will I.
But that'll be super interesting. On that note, we ran out of time, and I'd like to thank Dr. Eunice Chin to volunteer her time to speak with us and to share such a beautiful and nice perspective on plants. Thank you everyone for watching this, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.